The world stands at a turning point. Once again, Africa, often dismissed as the supplier of raw materials, has stepped into the very heart of the global storm. From Ghana's gold to Niger's uranium, from the cocoa of Côte d'Ivoire to the lithium beneath Zimbabwe's soil, a new movement is rising. Nations are no longer content to dig, ship, and watch others grow rich. They are declaring, no more. For decades, Europe and America powered their cities, built their industries, and ran their economies on the lifeblood of Africa's soil. Yet the children of that soil were left in poverty. Today, leaders like Ibrahim of Burkina Faso are refusing to repeat that history. They are standing tall, nationalizing resources, and demanding value for their people before 1 ounce, 1 grain, or 1 barrel leaves African ground. But this awakening comes with risk. The West is unsettled. Corporations are furious, and the world wonders. Will this be Africa's long-awaited second independence, or a dangerous gamble that could cost everything? If you believe Africa's awakening has already begun, subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the untold story. Across the continent, a quiet revolution is turning into a thunderous roar. In Ghana, once the jewel of colonial gold, the government has declared an end to the export of raw bauxite and unrefined gold. The message is clear. If the world wants Ghana's wealth, it must help build Ghana's industries. In Uganda, farmers who once sold raw coffee beans to Europe now watch as their government bans unprocessed exports, forcing global buyers to invest in roasting and processing plants at home. Gabon and Mozambique have taken the same path, restricting the export of raw timber to protect their forests and to create jobs through domestic processing. But perhaps the boldest move came from Niger, long treated as the uranium well of France. Niger stunned the world by halting uranium shipments threatening 70% of the electricity that powers French cities. For Paris, the lights of the Eiffel Tower suddenly depended on the will of Niamey. And in Burkina Faso, a young leader has become the face of this resistance. Captain Ibrahim is not only talking about sovereignty, he is building it. His government has announced the nationalization of gold mines and the construction of a state refinery capable of processing 150 tons of gold every year. For the first time in its history, Burkina Faso will hold its own reserves, turning gold from a colonial curse into a weapon of independence. To S supporters, he is a modern Zingara, a man refusing to bow, a leader daring to dream that Burkina's wealth belongs first to its children. To his critics, he is playing with fire, risking sanctions, isolation, even conflict. But what cannot be denied is this. His stand has electrified millions across Africa, from Mali to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where governments now question whether the old trade rules still serve their people. This is no longer just policy. It is a movement, and it is spreading. In Europe, the ripple felt like an earthquake. France, once confident in its grip on Niger's uranium, faced an energy crisis it had not anticipated. Analysts on French television admitted, sometimes with trembling voices, that our nuclear energy future depends on leaders we can no longer control. In Germany and Italy, industries already strained by global supply chains began to panic over the rising costs of raw materials. The United States also felt the Washington as defense planners recognized that cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo and lithium from Zimbabwe were not just commodities, they were the backbone of the electric vehicles, advanced batteries, and even weapons systems America was racing to produce. A secure future suddenly looked fragile, depended on the decisions of African governments that had grown tired of being ignored. The corporate world was perhaps the loudest in its protest. Multinational mining giants, who had operated in Africa for decades under favorable terms, rushed to their lobbies in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Their message was simple: this cannot stand. But the truth was undeniable. For the first time in modern history, Africa's resources were no longer guaranteed. The reaction in the media was telling. Western newspapers painted the leaders, especially Ibrahim of Burkina Faso, as reckless, radical, even dangerous. Yet on African streets, in markets and universities, the narrative was the opposite. Traore was not a threat. He was a hero. His image began to appear on murals, banners, and in songs, alongside words like sovereignty and freedom. The stage was set for confrontation. A rising Africa demanding dignity, and a world unprepared for the cost of its awakening. In Washington, the mood turned from concern to urgency. Policy briefings at the Pentagon and the State Department framed Africa not as a distant humanitarian challenge, but as a strategic front. Lithium, cobalt, uranium, these were no longer abstract resources. They were the arteries of America's green transition, its military readiness, and its economic security. We had them. Electric vehicles stall, satellites remain unlaunched, and defense systems falter. Quietly, U.S. envoys reached out to African capitals, offering new trade deals, promising investment, and warning against closer ties to Moscow and Beijing. For Russia, the moment was an opening. The Kremlin, long seeking to expand its influence in Africa, cast itself as a partner willing to respect sovereignty. Russian advisors and contractors appeared in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, offering security cooperation in exchange for resource access. For African leaders under pressure, Moscow's message carried weight. We'll not lecture you about democracy. We will help you defend your independence. China took a different approach. With its Belt and Road projects already entrenched across the continent, Beijing moved quickly to present itself as the guarantor of industrialization. Chinese companies offered to build refineries and processing plants, precisely what leaders like Ibrahim demanded. For every Western article warning of chaos, Chinese outlets highlighted mutual prosperity. It was a sharp contrast, and Africans noticed. Meanwhile, within Africa itself, the reaction was divided. Some governments like Guinea, Zimbabwe, and Mali embraced the wave, seeing in it a chance to rewrite their nation's futures. Others, especially in the Cowers, voiced caution, worried that abrupt restrictions might trigger sanctions, capital flight, or even coups. The African Union convened heated debates. Was this a path to economic rebirth, or a reckless gamble that could isolate the continent? Yet, in the streets, the debate was less cautious. Crowds chanted name. Social media lit up with hashtags like #resource sovereignty and #African Renaissance. For millions, this was not just economics. It was liberation. And in the eyes of many, Burkina Faso had become the beating heart of that liberation. The clash of visions was clear. To the West, this was a threat to the global order. To Africa, it was the long overdue reclaiming of dignity. The first and most visible consequence of Africa's resource sovereignty movement was felt in the lives of ordinary people. Markets across cities like Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey buzzed with a new kind of conversation. Vendors who once complained of low wages and high prices now spoke of pride that their nations were no longer simply shipping their wealth away. For once, one trader told a journalist, "We are fighting for our children, not for foreign companies." Among the youth, the response was even more powerful. Students at universities in Burkina Faso and Ghana held rallies, waving flags and posters of Ibrahim alongside the words sovereignty and freedom. On social media, millions of young Africans declared this the dawn of an African Renaissance. Their voices were defiant. We would rather endure hardship today than remain slaves tomorrow. Yet pride came with sacrifice. Prices for imported goods climbed as Western companies pulled back from contracts. In Niger, fuel shortages forced citizens to wait hours at gas stations. In Burkina Faso, construction projects slowed as foreign investors froze financing. Families felt the strain as inflation eroded their savings. Still, the popular mood was one of endurance. Older generations, who remembered the false promises of independence in the 1960s, told their children, "This time must be different. We cannot sell our land twice." Their words carried weight, echoing in churches, mosques, and community meetings. What emerged was a paradox. Hardship on the surface, but a deeper strength beneath. Citizens were learning to live with less, but they were also discovering a new dignity. Across the Sahel, radio hosts repeated the same message. We are paying the price of freedom. And for many Africans, that price, however steep, finally seemed worth paying.
If the social reaction carried the fire of pride, the political consequences carried the weight of uncertainty. Inside parliaments and presidential palaces, leaders faced mounting pressure. Some ministers urged caution, warning that abrupt export bans could bankrupt treasuries already stretched thin. Others, inspired by the rising popularity of men like Ibrahim, pushed for bolder reforms, believing hesitation would look like betrayal. The result was division at the very heart of governance. In countries like Guinea and Zimbabwe, governments leaned into the movement, tightening restrictions and accelerating plans for local processing plants. But elsewhere, hesitation led to paralysis. Legislators in Nigeria argued bitterly over whether to follow the same path with oil. The African Union, meant to speak with one voice, instead became a stage for heated disputes. Some delegates celebrated what they called Africa's second liberation, while others warned of diplomatic isolation, lost investment, and even famine. The instability opened dangerous cracks. Intelligence reports whispered of coup plots, particularly in fragile states where military officers viewed weak civilian governments as obstacles. The memory of recent putches in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso cast a long shadow for leaders across the Sahel. The question was clear: would sovereignty fuel unity, or ignite another cycle of coups and countercoups? Societies, too, began to divide. Urban elites, many of whom depended on imported goods and foreign partnerships, grumbled at rising costs and shrinking opportunities. But in rural areas, farmers and miners often embraced the changes, seeing them as a defense of their dignity. This divide between city and countryside risked deepening the political fault lines. For Burkina Faso, however, S. Gamble made him both a target and a symbol. International media painted him as a radical. At home, he was cheered as a savior. Such polarization left little room for middle ground. Either his vision would hold and inspire a continent, or it would collapse under the weight of political infighting and foreign pressure. The stakes had never been higher. Africa was rewriting its future, but the ink on that future was still wet. Vulnerable to smudges, sabotage, and storms yet to come.
In Washington, Africa has always been seen through a distant lens, often, as a place of humanitarian crises, security concerns, or great power competition. But the recent wave of resource nationalism led by figures like Ibrahim of Burkina Faso has forced the United States to confront Africa in a new light, not as a passive recipient of aid, but as an active shaper of global markets. For American industry, the implications are enormous. The push toward electric vehicles, advanced battery storage, and renewable energy all depends on minerals found in African soil. Cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, manganese from Gabon. Without these, the Biden administration's climate agenda faces crippling shortages. Corporations like Tesla, General Motors, and even defense contractors know that their supply chains now rest on the political choices of leaders once considered marginal. Strategically, the Pentagon has sounded the alarm. Reports warn that if the U.S. cannot secure reliable access to African resources, China and Russia will. This framing has pushed Africa from the back pages of policy briefings into the Situation Room itself. Suddenly, Burkina Faso and the Sahel are discussed not only as battlefields against extremism, but as critical nodes in the future of American power. Yet U.S. policymakers face a dilemma. Direct pressure through sanctions or military threats could backfire, hardening anti-Western sentiment already growing among African youth. But doing nothing risks ceding influence entirely to Moscow and Beijing. The compromise has been a mix of diplomatic outreach, promises of investment, and subtle warnings. Still, many Africans remember decades of broken promises, leaving Washington's words met with suspicion. Perhaps the sharpest challenge is cultural. American officials are accustomed to lecturing about democracy and governance. Leaders however, speak instead of sovereignty and dignity. These are values that resonate deeply with African publics, and they do not fit neatly into Washington's usual playbook. In the end, the U.S. sees a rising Africa not only as a resource question, but as a task can American foreign policy adapt to a continent no longer willing to be managed. If Washington views Africa as a strategic test, Europe feels it as an existential shock. Nowhere is this clearer than in France, whose nuclear grid depends on Niger's uranium. When Niamey announced restrictions, the effect was immediate. Contracts worth billions were suddenly in question, and the political debate in Paris turned urgent. For the French public, rising energy prices were more than an inconvenience. They symbolized the fragility of Europe's reliance on Africa. Other European states were no less anxious. Germany and Italy, dependent on cocoa, coffee, and timber for massive industries, scrambled to diversify supply chains. Emergency task forces warned of resource insecurity as a new geopolitical risk, on par with oil shocks of the 1970s. Brussels policymakers talked of partnership, but their tone betrayed unease. For decades, Europe had dictated the terms of exchange. Now, that balance was crumbling. In contrast, China saw opportunity. Beijing moved swiftly to position itself as Africa's partner of choice, expanding financing for refineries and infrastructure. Where Western firms hesitated, Chinese companies offered joint ventures. Critics in Washington describe this as Beijing locking in Africa's future. But in African capitals, the message sounded different. Here was a partner willing to build, not just by Russia, though economically weaker, played a different card. Moscow cast itself as Africa's political ally, praising resource nationalism as a strike against neocolonialism. Through media campaigns and security partnerships, the Kremlin framed figures like Ibrahim as symbols of resistance against Western domination. The result was an ideological bond, not just an economic one, reinforcing Moscow's image as a defender of sovereignty. The global consequences were immediate. Commodity markets from London to New York grew volatile as cocoa, gold, and uranium prices surged. Corporations adjusted forecasts. Governments revised trade strategies. An analyst debated whether this was a temporary disturbance or the birth of a multipolar order where Africa held real leverage. What is clear is that Africa has moved from the margins to the center of geopolitics. By asserting control over its resources, the continent has forced the world to listen. For Europe, it is a crisis. For China and Russia, an opening. For the United States, a challenge. And for Africa itself, perhaps the first step toward rewriting centuries of unequal exchange. Across Africa, the debate over resource sovereignty did not remain confined to conference halls or diplomatic cablesets spilled into the streets. In Ouagadougou, students painted murals of Ibrahim fists raised against a backdrop of gold mines and green fields. The words, "Our wealth, our future," blazing across concrete walls. In Bamako, young men draped in national flags marched through dusty avenues, chanting songs of freedom. These were not the orchestrated parades of old regimes. They were spontaneous, raw, and filled with both anger and pride. For many Africans, this was the first time they felt their leaders were speaking their language, not repeating Western scripts. "We are poor because we have been robbed," shouted a Malian protester into a megaphone. "Now we are taking back what is ours." But alongside the fire of pride came the shadow of fear. Shopkeepers in Niamey whispered about rising costs, unsure how long they could survive without imports. Mothers in Burkina Faso worried as the price of rice doubled, then tripled. At night, families gathered around radios to hear news of sanctions, embargoes, and threats from foreign powers. The mood shifted with each broadcast, one moment hopeful, the next anxious. Social media amplified both extremes. Videos of jubilant crowds went viral, painting a picture of a continent united, but just as quickly, clips of empty shelves and fuel lines circulated, fueling doubts. Comment sections burned with debates. Is this freedom worth the suffering? Some may say, yes. Others shook their heads. The emotional weight was enormous. Too many. The movement felt like a second independence, a chance to correct the unfinished business of the 1960s. To others, it felt like a dangerous gamble, risking today's bread for tomorrow's promise. Between these poles stretched the daily lives of millions, caught in the turbulence of history. And yet, through all the hardship, a single conviction echoed again and again. Better hardship with dignity than comfort in chains. If the streets carried the raw pulse of the people, the political stage provided its own drama. Delegates spoke, not with the cautious tone of bureaucrats, but with the urgency of men and women who felt the tide of history pressing against them. When Ibrahim rose to speak, the room fell silent. His words were sharp. We will not trade sovereignty for aid. We will not be beggars on our own land. Applause erupted, not polite but thunderous, spilling into chants that echoed through the hall. Similar scenes unfolded at the United Nations. Western diplomats shuffled their papers, visibly unsettled, as African representatives invoked centuries of exploitation. The rhetoric was fiery. You told us to open our markets. We opened them and you stripped us bare. Now we close them and you call us radical. These words traveled far beyond the chamber, replayed on television screens across Africa, stirring both pride and defiance. But the drama did not stop at official speeches. In Ghana, civil society groups hosted public forums where intellectuals compared the moment to the Bonn Conference of 1955, when Asia and Africa first declared independence from colonial influence. In Senegal, musicians turned sovereignty into rhythm, releasing songs that blended traditional drums with lyrics about dignity and freedom. Art and politics merged, amplifying the sense that something larger than economics was at stake. The intensity carried risks. Security forces were placed on high alert amid rumors of foreign-backed plots. In capitals from Niamey to Conakry, whispers of coups swirled, raising the stakes of every decision. Yet the fear only deepened the sense of destiny. Citizens spoke of walking into the storm with their heads high. The climax was not a single event, but a crescendo fusion of speeches, protests, songs, and sacrifices. Africa's streets and parliaments beat to the same drum. A determination to seize control of history, whatever the cost. Imagine a decade from now. The gamble of sovereignty pays off. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the world's poorest nations, becomes a model of under President Ibrahim's leadership. Resource wealth no longer leaks out through foreign contracts but is reinvested in schools, hospitals, and industries. Children who once walked miles to learn in crumbling classrooms now sit in well-equipped schools, powered by solar grids built from African minerals. The ripple spreads beyond borders. In Niger, uranium revenues financed new energy plants that light up villages long forgotten. In Mali, gold wealth supports road networks, connecting rural farmers to urban markets. What once were dusty outposts of dependency turn into nodes of opportunity. Ordinary citizens begin to see, not justier, that independence has tangible rewards. This vision is not utopia. It is built on discipline and sacrifice. African governments learn to negotiate as a bloc, setting terms collectively, much like OPEC once did for oil. They invest in local refining instead of exporting raw, or they create regional stabilization funds to cushion against sanctions and price shocks. Instead of competing for foreign favor, they compete to demonstrate competence at home. For the West, this shift brings both challenge and chance. American businesses that once assumed easy access must now partner on equal terms. But for forward-looking investors, the opportunities are immense. African nations, rich not only in minerals, but in youthful labor, growing markets, and political will. The African news cycle in this scenario is no longer dominated by conflict, but by progress reports. Rising literacy, growing GDP, and reduced dependence on aid. The cultural impact is just as profound. Generations raised on narratives of exploitation now tell different stories of resilience, dignity, and agency. Musicians, filmmakers, and writers broadcast Africa's rebirth to the world, and through it all, leaders like Ibrahim are remembered not as rebels, but as reformers who dared to dream beyond survival. But history does not always bend toward hope. There is another path, one that many elders whisper with dread. In this scenario, the resource nationalism, led by Burkina Faso and Ibrahim falters. Under pressure, sanctions bite deeper than expected. Trade routes collapse, inflation spirals, and the poor, those meant to be protected, bear the heaviest burden. Disillusionment grows. Crowds that once cheered in Ouagadougou and Bamako turn restless, their chants shifting from freedom to food. In markets across West Africa, empty stalls and soaring prices ignite frustration. Instead of unity, divisions widen. Some accuse their governments of mismanagement. Others suspect corruption, the same old disease under a new flag of sovereignty. The international stage becomes harsher. Western powers, unwilling to cede ground, intensify embargoes and quietly fund opposition groups. Hopes once fading from Africa's political landscape make a grim return, toppling fragile administrations, rival factions within the military vie for power, while foreign intelligence agencies maneuver in the shadows. The hope of independence curdles into cycles of instability. Meanwhile, outside powers like China and Russia seize the vacuum, but not always in ways that benefit ordinary Africans. Projects that once promised shared prosperity devolve into new dependencies contracts that trade one form of control for another. Citizens begin to wonder if sovereignty was just a slogan, another chapter in the long saga of being used. The cultural mood turns heavy. Songs of resistance fade into laments. Intellectuals speak of a lost decade, warning that the window of opportunity has closed, and the African news headlines shift once more, no longer about rising dignity but about conflict, refugee flows, and political crises. In this darker vision, Ibrahim is remembered not as a reformer but as a cautionary tale, a man who inspired his people yet could not shield them from the storm. His bold defiance, instead of sparking a renaissance, risks leaving scars of hunger and division that may take generations to heal. Africa today stands at a crossroads. The choices made in Burkina Faso, the speeches of Ibrahim, and the sacrifices of ordinary citizens are more than national events. They are threads in a larger story of a continent, reclaiming its destiny. Whether this journey ends in triumph or tragedy will depend not only on leaders, but on the resilience of the people and the clarity of their vision. What cannot be denied is that a new spirit has been awakened. From the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the global stages of Addis Ababa and New York, Africans are declaring, "We will no longer be silent. We will no longer be bound." This awakening may yet be fragile, but it is unmistakable. As Americans, we are called to watch with humility and respect. For in Africa's struggle, we are reminded of our own history, our own fight for freedom, and our own belief that dignity is worth sacrifice. President Traoré's words echo still. We do not ask permission to be free. We stood up and claimed it. If his courage speaks to your heart, share this story. Subscribe to join us on this journey toward an Africa that will never bow again. God bless Africa.